My guest today is Zaid Dahhaj. She is the co-host of the 2 a.m. podcast with well over 200 episodes. Congratulations on that. And since 2022, he's been on Substack with an interestingly named The Circadian Classroom, where he focuses on the underlying drivers of chronic disease and circadian biology. He's got a talent for simplifying concepts surrounding our synthetic and natural light environment. Zaid, welcome to the EMF Remedy podcast.
Thank you, Keith. I've actually been a big fan of the podcast for probably 6 or so months now. So it's really cool to be on here and have a discussion with you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. So I would like to get into this discussion about circadian biology. And for those people who have never been exposed to this, maybe we can get through a primer, if you will. But I just want to start off by saying I spend all of my time helping people with minimizing their synthetic EMF exposure. And everything in the circadian world deals not with the not with the synthetic electromagnetic fields, but with the natural electromagnetic fields. So I don't know if it's a yin and a yang, or I don't know if one is a cure for the other, but I do know that my experience in recovering from electromagnetic poisoning, and a lot of other people that I've talked to have really embraced this idea of getting resynchronized with the rhythms that are obviously around us. So how should we begin talking about circadian biology and your work?
Sure thing. And my philosophy has always been that they're one and the same. Because if we look at the electromagnetic spectrum, I mean, it encompasses everything within our environment. So you can talk about the full light spectrum from the sun all the way to X-rays and gamma rays. And so I kind of view it as a yin yang. It's just about having the understanding around these subjects and then making sure that you're able to implement them through lifestyle choices. And so the primer that I give on circadian biology is relatively simple. I firmly believe through the literature that every aspect of the body is circadian in nature. Circadian biology is the fundamental that controls everything else. So it's basically the keystone pillar of human biology. And it ties into this idea that the human body is designed to sense time through various external circadian cues known as Zeitgebers. And light is the most fundamental and powerful Zeitgeber. And this is where we have the distinction between sunlight versus artificial light, and a few other things like meal timing, socializing, temperature. All of those are external circadian cues that tell your body where it is in time and space in relation to the circadian mechanisms involved within the body. So, yeah, I mean, you can basically think of the body as one intricate clock with a bunch of subclocks within it that are timed to each cell and tissue in the body. And as a result, we need to understand that this controls everything from the immune system to your potential of developing chronic disease to mental function. And so it's I've always viewed it as the keystone pillar that holds everything else together.
That's great. So, and in times past, things were very different because people didn't have to think about their biological timing, their circadian rhythms with regard to what's going on in the environment, because we lived more closely to the earth, right?
I mean, spot on. We didn't have the it depends on what time period we want to focus on, but I believe ever since 1879, when we started to electrify the world, prior to that event, we were in sync with the natural circadian rhythm, basically just following the solar cycle as it should be. We used candles, we used incandescents. So we had a more circadian friendly environment, especially from the lighting perspective. And we were more connected to the earth. And so we would farm more, we would be outside most of the time. But if you look at today, I mean, it couldn't be any more divorced from the evolutionary background of how we evolved. I mean, from our lighting system to the fact that we don't even grow food for the most part, depending on who you are, most people don't. And if we look at the lighting, we've basically created an environment where there is no light and dark cycle. There is no yin and yang. As a matter of fact, it's just focused on the light portion. And people spend upwards of 90+% of their time indoors under toxic artificial light. So that gives you an idea of why we have so many problems, from heart disease to neurodegeneration and so forth.
So years ago, when people lived closer to the Earth, the light from the sun would rise in the morning, and it would increase in luminosity, and the color of the light first thing in the morning is different than it is in midday, and it's different than it is at sunset. And if we were working on the land, if we had an agricultural vocation, we would be out in that light, probably from before the time the sun rose through sunrise, and it would almost be impossible to be divorced from those influences. Then if we look at the industrialization of the world, really, we started to move into factories and whatnot, but windows were still very prevalent, and people either walked to work, rode a bicycle, rode a horse, whatever. And so still they had those clues of light. And yet now we don't really have that so much. People are spending more and more time indoors, and the lighting inside is, if I had to come up with toxic lighting, I think I would come up with what exists in our supermarkets today. So let's begin. Let's talk about the importance of getting proper light exposures for the body.
Yeah, and I think you started it off with a really nice idea, and it's this gradual development throughout the day of how the sun's light changes, the full light spectrum changes. So if we start at the morning time, watching sunrise, in my opinion, is probably the most powerful habit that someone can develop for a number of reasons. I mean, we can talk about the fact that there's a phenomenon known as Rayleigh scattering, to where, due to the fact that the sun is at a specific place and the light is coming at a certain angle within the atmosphere, it actually scatters a lot of the shorter light wavelengths. So this is blue and violet. This is why you find no UV light during the early morning time. And it focuses more on the longer wavelengths. So it's basically pure systemic regeneration with red and infrared light from my standpoint. And that can get into so many things. I mean, we're talking about regenerating the non-visual photoreceptors within the body. These are light sensing proteins that actually are attuned to specific wavelengths that the sun provides. We can talk about the impact that has on the development or the stimulation of aromatic amino acids, which then lead into neurotransmitter production, dopamine, serotonin, all of the classic ones that you can think about. The regeneration of the skin barrier. Red and infrared light has been shown to stimulate the production of collagen, hyaluronic acid, elastin, so think skin elasticity, which basically just brings about a more youthful skin barrier and look and appearance. And then, other things including hormonal production, and just everything in the body. This is why I call it the keystone pillar, because it just influences everything, which is mind-blowing to me. And there's some other different effects as you go into midday. UV light, UVA and UVB have some different health benefits. And then more towards sunset, I believe it's a wind down period, to where you get the signal to the body where you start to produce melatonin. And as a result, that facilitates the process of sleep and just preparing yourself for overall sleep processes.
So for people who are new to this, who maybe had public education like I did when I was young, or went to a public university, we're meant to believe that we just get up and we have a bowl of Cheerios, and that is our sustenance for the morning, and then we go about our day. But light is, I don't know, you could view it as a nutrient or an essential component and whatnot. You mentioned specific frequency tuning in some of the proteins in our bodies, and I think that's really illustrative of the fact that if these things are tuned for certain wavelengths, it's obvious that they're meant to receive those wavelengths. So can you talk about things in that context?
And that's exactly what I've always tried to push ever since I've discovered a lot of this information. It's, when you start to go into the steroid hormones, for example, and this applies to both women and men, whether it's progesterone, testosterone, DHT, estradiol. If you actually dive into what these steroid hormones are supposed to receive from a light absorption perspective, the nanometers, then we get into the territory of biophoton emission. So I think it falls between 200 to maybe 2 40 or 250 nanometers. And so that not only points to the idea that the sun's light is important to stimulate these processes, but it also points to the idea that we actually produce our own endogenous light via every cell and tissue in the body. And that's always been my philosophy around trying to disprove the centralized narrative, especially the dermatologists and ophthalmologists who believe that UV light or the sun's light in general is inherently toxic or damaging. I've always liked to point to these specific things in relation to circadian and evolutionary biology to then point them in the direction that we are actually supposed to receive this light for systemic function. I mean, it's just it's a true and timeless universal principle for me, because evolutionary biology in the way the human species has evolved and every other species is all the evidence is there. It's available for us to study. And what's interesting is that a lot of these light mechanisms and processes actually take place across all species. So the circadian rhythm is fundamental to all life on Earth.
Yeah, so you mean that I'm not supposed to be afraid of UV light like I've been taught since I was a kid, and every dermatologist in my life has reiterated. And I don't know, have you read the book called Health and Light?
Not as of yet. I do want to pick that up soon.
So that was written, I don't know, late 70s, early 80s, maybe early 70s, I'm not sure. Anyway, it was written by a long time ago by a fellow by the name of John Ott. He was a photographer, and he was one of the first ones who got into stop motion photography. And so he was using this new tool to illustrate plant growth. And if you know anything about photography, it is all horrendous light. You know, you're dealing with this artificial light, and there can be emissions that are quite unnatural and whatnot. So he actually got sick doing the work that he was doing, probably because of all the artificial light in his studio, but there's no way to prove that. But he began developing arthritis, and what he did to cure it is so interesting. He took his glasses off because ordinary glasses will inhibit. It won't pass through the full spectrum of sunlight. And he began exposing himself and his eyes. He wasn't looking into the sun, but exposing his eyes to, in particular, ultraviolet radiation. And what he reported is it cured his arthritis. So is that the craziest thing you've ever heard, or is that pretty much in line with what you believe the magnitude of the effects can be of natural light exposure, and maybe pointing to why we have so much chronic disease? Your comments on that?
I think it's perfectly in line. I'm not surprised by any of these results, as a matter of fact, because if we take a look at the body, the gateway to the body is, in my opinion, two things: the eye and the skin. Those are the interfaces between you and the environment when it comes to biological or systemic function. And so even I have looked at a few things with John Ott's work, his study on various animals and how light via the eyes can impact hormone production and cortisol, ACTH, all of this stuff. It's very interesting because it points to the idea that light fundamentally into the eyes and into the skin. We also need to remember that the skin, eyes, and brain are one trio. They work as one unit. This is what we call neuroectoderm, that is developed when you are an embryo in your mother's womb. It works in tandem with light. And so once we understand that there is no separation, there is no reductionism when it comes to human biology, then we can get to the point where we understand that hormones are tied to the light and dark cycle. Everything is tied to the light and dark cycle. There is no separation. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with the centralized philosophy today, is that it is a hyper-reductionist philosophy that views things from separate standpoints, when in reality, it's all connected. I mean, that just strikes at the heart of holism for me.
Yeah, so getting back to, the first exposure of light in the morning, my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that light exposure first thing in the morning and the color signature it has, which is another way of saying the frequencies that are being produced by the morning sun, trigger the production of cortisol. And that is meant to happen, according to my understanding, early in the day. We need People view cortisol as a very bad thing, but we need it to get through the day, to endure the insults and assaults of various stresses during the day. But it's not helpful to have all day. It's not helpful to have all day long. And there's something particular about the artificial lighting that is offered to us and the screens that we have all around us and have integrated so tightly into our lives that have a bearing on this. So correct me if I'm wrong, and tell me about cortisol production, for example, in the morning, and artificial light.
Sure. So first things first, we have to understand that cortisol and other hormones like melatonin follow a diurnal rhythm. So they follow a circadian pattern. So like you mentioned, cortisol is supposed to be high in the morning. I believe right before you wake up, around the time when you do wake up. And then gradually as the day goes on and we head into the evening time, it's supposed to be at its lowest around the time when it's, night right before bed.
It
And it's
might be what wakes us up, right?
that's my philosophy. I think that cortisol does wake us up to prepare us for the day and get about all of this systemic function. And what's interesting is that cortisol and melatonin have an inverse relationship. So when cortisol is high, melatonin's at its lowest, and then vice versa. But it also points to a more interesting part of this discussion with circadian biology, and that's the POMC system, the pro-opiomelanocortin system within the entire body, but most notably the brain and the skin. And what the POMC system is it's basically we all have this gene. Some people have rare genetic issues with this gene, but most people have this intact, working well. And it is supposed to receive the light signal from UV light specifically, but I do also believe that red and infrared and the morning light stimulates it as well. And basically, it is the most powerful pharmacy within your brain and body ever. It's responsible for the production of various peptide hormones like alpha, beta, melanocyte stimulating hormone. If you go through the literature and you study these hormones, I mean, talk about its anti-inflammatory effects, antiviral, responsible for producing melanin, which is nature's sunscreen, and various other functions. You also have beta endorphin, which is an opioid peptide. So this gets into the idea of, recovering from addiction. If you are somebody who deals with extra sensory pain or something of that nature, UV light is going to be an important part of the discussion. But two interesting things in relation to cortisol. The POMC system activates two peptide hormones known as ACTH and CLIP. These are just abbreviations. But ACTH is responsible for actually stimulating the cortisol response, and CLIP is an insulin secretagogue. So it works in tandem with ACTH, but CLIP most notably is it's responsible for the production of insulin as well from the pancreas. And so this gets into the idea with artificial light that it could potentially increase cortisol and insulin with blood sugar, independent of any food that you put into your system. Now, this hasn't been verified per se through the scientific literature, but I think we have enough tertiary evidence to point in that direction. And so this is where we get into the idea that artificial light could potentially put you in a higher cortisol state chronically, and it could also put you right in the grip of prediabetes and type 2 diabetes as well.
So if we're viewing blue screens, that blue that comes from those screens, and by the way, all of the LED lighting, or the majority of the LED lighting that people are putting in their homes now, it has a blue cast to it, and that's okay. Blue is produced by the sun as well, except that it peaks and it waxes and wanes, during the day, and it's never in isolation. It's never like a discrete frequency or just around the blues. It always comes with other things, and we've talked about ultraviolet as the highest frequencies, and infrared, near infrared and far infrared, bounding sort of the visible ones. So it's just wrong from a biological perspective to continue to expose ourselves, no matter what that peak of blue light is communicating to our bodies. It's essentially saying it's the same time, morning, noon, and night, if you're staring at those screens or if you're underneath the LED lights. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. I think it goes levels deeper too. I mean, if you think about a clock, I mean, make us to relate us to a clock is a little bit oversimplistic, but I think it gets the point across. If the clock was just stuck at 12 at noon all day long and it didn't change to tell the time accurately, then all of our schedules would be chaotic and things would not function properly. And so when you take that into how the body works, considering that there are thousands of little clocks and that the entire system is designed to sense time, most especially using light, then we can start to comprehend and understand how doing this over months, weeks, years is really throwing things off from not only a hormonal perspective, but at the subatomic level, if you want to dive deep into that aspect. And yeah, like you mentioned, this isolated blue peak found in modern lighting is inherently toxic because we didn't find that in nature. Like I always believe that Mother Nature is the wisest crafter of anything out there because the level of perfection and intricacy involved in human biology is astonishing. I mean, it's honestly on the divine. It borders on the divine, in my opinion. So we need to understand that every part of the system is tuned perfectly to the environment as we evolved to it. But the problem is, of course, today is that we've thrown the environment completely off because we can re-engineer specific things. We have smart meters, we have artificial lights, we have lighting after sunset. And so, yeah, it absolutely throws off the timing system of the body, and that influences everything.
People are going to doctors or whatever source, and they're getting medications to put into their bodies to achieve a desired result. But we have a pharmacy, an entire pharmacy, and an entire production capacity within our bodies that is specifically made to produce the medications, the hormones, the peptides, neurotransmitters inside of our bodies. And so much of that is controlled by our light exposures. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah. Every neurotransmitter and hormone in the body, peptide hormone, is controlled by light. And all you need, the only evidence you need to look at that and to understand that is really just to understand the absorption peak of the specific hormone or neurotransmitter you're studying. I mean, if you look at like the aromatic amino acids, you have phenylalanine, you have a couple other ones, and you study the direct relationship between the production of those aromatic amino acids and neurotransmitter production. I mean, it's a straight shot using light, UV light specifically, because these aromatic amino acids are made of photon traps, otherwise known as benzene rings. Their structure is literally designed to capture and use a photon. And so diving into that territory just makes it unequivocal.
Yeah, that is so interesting. And do they ascertain what frequency ranges are these various structures are designed for by observing fluorescence, or how are they doing that with regard to the frequency of light that they're expecting or optimized for?
I'm not sure about the specific scientific technique. I think they're just using like a tracing method to where they can find areas of the body that light up in relation to this tracing method. That goes way above my head. I do need to study that to learn more about it, but I believe that's how they do it.
So going back to this model of people going to get medications to deal with symptoms and to produce certain substances within the body, if our body is the one who's actually in charge of that and the body is not producing those compounds for a reason, then adding it from the outside, if in fact what's needed is proper light exposure, is folly, right?
Yeah, and like I said, the hyper reductionist philosophy is getting us nowhere. As a matter of fact, it's making things worse. And we can look at the chronic disease rates surging from every angle ever since, let's say, the 1950s, and it's not stopping. And there is no trend of it stopping, which is scary, even though all of these pharmaceutical companies are throwing money at these problems. They're making new drugs almost every year. So that gives you an idea of how misguided the centralized system is, which is where I like to talk about decentralized philosophy and really taking more of a grassroots approach while also grounding ourselves in the understanding of circadian and evolutionary biology and being rooted in the science as well. And this is something that I like to do a lot, which is to, whenever I'm having an interaction with someone who's more centralized and who believes that the sun is toxic, and who believes in the standard narrative, I like to use their own research against them to point out the flaws. For example, like this idea that UV light causes skin cancer. What most people don't understand is that all of the research studies done on UV light has been done with UV light in isolation in an artificially blue lit environment, which is toxic, oftentimes on albino nocturnal animals.
What
And
could
so
be what could go wrong?
what could
Right?
go wrong? I mean, that study design is quite literally developed to get you the outcome that you're seeking, but it doesn't translate to a circadian creature who is diurnal, who evolved under the full light spectrum from the sun. It just doesn't equate.
Yeah, and so let me let you continue on that, but just to mention how absurd it is. I often wonder whether half the medical research is not just um, garbage, because are they controlling for light exposures? Are they even mentioning what the light exposures are in the lab? And the book that I mentioned before with John Ott, he spent a lot of time looking at substances which would allow light, the full spectrum of light, everything from infrared to visible and ultraviolet, to pass through. You know, we have these windows in our homes and we think that we get light that comes through them, but we always lose something. And you know, there is only one compound that he found. He looked at polycarbonate, he looked at acrylic plastic, he looked at plain glass, he looked at a number of different things, and he found that the only window that would allow full transmission of all of the light from the sun is air. So he made air curtains to control his experiments. Now, what labs are going to that extent? I mean, what are these rats and mice and whatnot living in? If they're living in plastic, then whatever the light exposure they're getting, you know, could be modified as well. So, yeah, forgive me for interrupting you. You were talking about the hyper reductionist nature of our world right now, and I just can't get past this thought, and I would like your comments on it about all the research that's done. It hasn't even been controlled for light exposures, and all of the harm that we're meant to believe of ultraviolet light from the sun is in the absence of infrared light.
Yeah.
Or
I
the
mean,
rest of the visible spectrum, and it's on furry, nocturnal rodents, not mammals. So I don't know. I'll let you.
yeah, I mean, which there are similarities between, you know, mice and human beings, but when we're talking about the input of light and circadian biology, just the mere fact that we are diurnal and they're nocturnal changes things entirely, especially when it comes to how light interacts with the skin and things of that nature. But what you were mentioning ties perfectly into this discussion of hyperreductionism when it comes to how science is created these days. So not only do they have no light controls, not a single study in the world I can guarantee that's been done on UV light and the relationship between skin cancer and the full light spectrum from the sun has been done using light controls. Tying into your subject of expertise, they certainly don't use non-native EMF controls. Um, and so just on the basis of that alone, you can throw out the research. You quite literally cannot come up with anything related to the truth that we find in nature, because that is just not the environment that nature has. And so I think it's important for people to actually go through the research themselves and look at how they're doing these studies, because you know, people need to understand the difference between in vitro and in vivo. They need to understand the hierarchy of scientific evidence, all the way from observational data to a randomized controlled trial to a meta-analyses. That stuff is very important when it comes to having these discussions, but I can tell you that the centralized philosophy today wants everything to be controlled in a lab setting. That doesn't happen in nature. That does not happen in nature.
Let's talk about a therapy that was used historically to great effect and that helped a lot of people, something called heliotherapy. And what can we learn from that with regard to the subject that we're talking about today?
So heliotherapy and studying that realm has been one of my favorite subjects lately because it gives us a clear idea of the power of the full light spectrum from the sun in relation to healing the body from very serious conditions like advanced stage tuberculosis, rickets. You could talk about various other conditions as well, but two individuals come to mind through my study. Number one is Niels Ryberg Finson. He was the first person to actually study heliotherapy in relation to some of these disease models. He actually used red light for things like smallpox and tuberculosis. He used UV light, funneled it through quartz glass to heal a lot of the advanced stage tuberculosis disease models in patients. And another one who comes to mind is Auguste Rollier, who basically used Finson's work, who, by the way, won a Nobel Prize on this work. And Auguste Rollier started up the first heliotherapy clinic in the world. I believe it was in Switzerland.
And the time frame?
Time frame is early 1900s, probably 1900 to maybe 1915. I think around that time frame. And the results that Auguste Rollier found were spectacular because, and this also points to the idea that he was in high altitude. Switzerland was a prime location for this, a lot more UV light coming in. And so he would take these patients, they would live there, and he would sunbathe them properly and religiously throughout a certain period of time. And the results are astonishing. I mean, I point to this one case of a 6-year-old boy who had advanced stage tuberculosis. And within 6 months of consistent heliotherapy, he healed himself altogether through Auguste's framework. And so this just points to the power of this work. And it also points to the flawed ideas within centralized medicine that UV light inherently causes skin cancer or anything of this nature.
So the patients that were treated at these kinds of facilities, some of them were very delicate. Some of them had never, well, they didn't have what we might call today a solar callus. So can you talk about how some of these patients were introduced to the high intensity ultraviolet light at these facilities?
It is a very interesting question. I think we have to give credit to the people of the past, especially those two individuals, because the way they approach this work with sunbathing specifically is nothing short of flawless, in my opinion. I think there are some things that they could have worked on, but they understood that the morning light was important to get exposed to. As a matter of fact, to prime the skin via red and infrared light to then handle more UV light in the midday. And this happens through various things via the production of filigrin and then uricanic acid, which are skin proteins that are moisturizing for the skin and protective of the skin. And then they understood the concept of microdosing at first, if the individual doesn't have a tan. And then through a process of progressive overload, through that principle, which we can find in training and in resistance training and whatnot, we get the person used to sunbathing and we give them more leverage over time because they have built up more melanin in their system, both internally and externally on their skin. And so that's basically the game. It's just priming in the morning time, preparing the skin for the midday UV light signal, and then being smart and wise about midday exposure. Like, I'm not telling people to go out and bake for eight hours in the day. That's certainly not my recommendation. I think you have to be very wise about it because the sun's light is very powerful.
And it wasn't just respiratory issues that were being addressed at these facilities, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, you could talk about everything from arthritis to potentially even mental illness, like seeing some great improvement on that end. I forgot what other conditions were mentioned, but it's powerful across the board for it.
Infrared light, in particular, near infrared light, penetrates very deeply into the body. People may think that it's only a skin effect, but that's not really the case. So when you start to consider the not only the neurotransmitter and the peptide and the hormone production, but actually reaching the inner organs with near infrared light in particular. It's quite amazing.
It is, and this is something I've studied recently, actually, and it's people have this concept that near infrared light hits the skin and just goes directly deep into the body. But what's fascinating about this is that it actually scatters countless times within the body, with under the original skin layer, and that actually allows it to spend more time within the body to then find weak absorbers of that near infrared light, to then hold on to that light and then transfer it to more strong absorbers within the body. And so if we think about like water or blood, hemoglobin, all of these things absorb water or absorb infrared to a certain degree. And I think that near infrared gets anywhere between like 10 to 30 centimeters within the body. So it gets in pretty deep. But I have a hunch it gets in even deeper through the mechanism of not only the scattering effect with photons from the sun, but also the fact that it can be carried by the water via the blood vessels to other parts of the body. And I've seen this myself. I've seen people shine just, let's say, a red light therapy device at their knee, and it's actually caused improvements in other organ systems because of this effect of being carried throughout the entire micro and macro vasculature.
What are your thoughts about LED panels, red light therapy panels in particular?
Yeah, it depends on how the manufacturer makes them. I think they have to be very educated in this realm. It's not a replacement for the sun by any means, but I've used it enough and I've seen other people use it enough to show therapeutic benefits. So I view it more so as a tool. The only question is, and it ties into your work as well, like what is the non-native EMF reading off of that? At what distance does that stop being a problem? And then most importantly, is it using the right wavelengths at the right intensity to then enact therapeutic benefit? So I think it's a tool, but people really need to be educated in the matter of, look, go outside, because over 50% of the sun's spectrum at all times is red and infrared light. So that should point you in the direction that the sun is the best form of red light therapy out there.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about the red light panels myself, or including the visible and infrared portions. I've seen incredible benefit. I've had people come to me and report that they had suffered for many years with seasonal affective disorder, and they got a red light panel and it went away. That's not according to the narrative, and it happened very quickly. And it isn't the blue light that we're taught is the main treatment for that. So I don't know quite what's going on with that. I've seen some benefit. I do have some concerns about the panels, of course, with regard to the synthetic EMF exposures associated with power line frequencies and dirty electricity primarily. Although some of them actually use radio frequency radiation based controls, so it's just very silly. But I guess the biggest thing that bothers me about the panels is they're using these light emitting diodes, which are centered on one particular frequency, and there'll be a little bit of scatter around those frequencies, but they're trying to take and identify what are the most biologically active frequencies to get into the body, and then they put an emitter for each one of those that they find. And to me, that just seems reductionist lunacy, because the spectrum that we get from the sun is continuous. It may start way over here, but it's every single frequency from one end to the other, and changes according to the time of day. But it's a continuous function. It's not a discrete function like in the panels. So what are your thoughts on that?
I fully agree. I think that, photobiomodulation panels, even though they show a lot of promise when it comes to, like, in reality, people are experiencing benefit. I think it completely distracts from the idea that we should just be outside under the grace and the power of the full light spectrum from the sun. For the reasons that you've mentioned, it offers a full spectrum. All of these wavelengths are perfectly balanced according to your biology, because via circadian biology, evolutionary biology, that's what we were designed to receive as an input. And I think it does contribute to the hyper-reductionist problem because it doesn't educate people from a holistic standpoint. Like if I tell somebody to, or if somebody approaches an individual and they're trying to push red light therapy panels, but they offer no education around the full light spectrum from the sun in other areas, then we're only contributing to the problem because we're keeping people inside. They're not getting any of the far infrared or any of the other wavelengths associated with these health benefits. And yeah, I can see that as a huge problem.
Yeah. So for me, although I have seen some benefits, my Biomax 900 is on Craigslist. I'm getting rid of it. And it has a really nice stand as well. But yeah, it's just not the future for me. I think in the winter when I can't, because I live pretty far north, like 50 miles from the Canadian border, so I can't get the luscious sunshine that you do in your location year round. So I've moved to an infrared incandescent based sauna for the winter time, and for the summer, none of that. I'm
You don't
outdoors.
need it.
A specific objective for how much time can I spend at midday? Um, can I possibly get outdoors just prior to sunrise? I live in a forest, so I don't really have a hope of seeing the sunrise. But people can't get, this perfectionist mindset that in case if they don't have this perfect exposure, it isn't going to work. But I just try to get out there before the sun rises and and do the best I can to get some of that early morning sun, and then at midday and in the afternoon as well, if I can. So maybe we should transition into talking about, because we have probably thoroughly confused people who this is this is their first exposure to. What you mean light is important? Um, what are some of the takeaways that and before we quit, don't let me forget. I understand through the grapevine you're putting together a circadian training. So we're going to talk about that before we're finished. But give us an idea. What are things that everybody can do where they can benefit their own biology using the natural sunshine?
Absolutely. So it might seem daunting to people who are diving into the scientific domain. They're studying all this stuff with like nanometer lengths and biophotons, but in practice, it's very simple. It's more simple than people want to make it out to be, which is awesome because people can get into this work and there's not really much of a barrier outside maybe of specific circumstances. But number one, watch sunrise while grounded to a natural conductive Earth surface. That is by far probably the most powerful thing you can do. For the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Midday sunbathing with most of the skin exposed. Approach that from a microdose perspective if you are new to it. If you're a novice, microdose it for maybe 5 to 10 minutes. Go inside, spend time under shade to get the benefits of that near infrared radiation off of the greenery in your environment, and approach it kind of like training. Approach it day in and day out, and over time, relatively quickly as well, you'll notice that your tolerance for midday sunlight increases because you've developed more melanin, which blocks 99% of all UV because it's Mother Nature's sunscreen. A few other things I would say: keeping the windows open if you're indoors is a big one because of the artificial manipulation of the full light spectrum that we've talked about. For people who don't know, most glass, especially low emission glass, changes the spectrum in such a way that it blocks UVB, and it depends on the glass as well. If you're in a car, it's as different from passenger side window to windshield, but in general, it will block UVB, focus UVA and blue light together, and then substantially reduce a lot of the red and infrared, which are the protective mechanism to those other wavelengths. And so from my standpoint and through the literature, I literally believe that getting sunlight exposure directly through that type of glass causes skin cancer. And then some other things, I mean, making it as dark as possible after sunset is very important because the light and dark cycle is a coupled system. So you need to have those two in check. And this can look in the form of anything. I mean, you could do circadian friendly lighting. I like the red lights. You could do candles. You can just have the blue light blockers on, cover most of your skin. because the skin senses light as well. And probably avoiding food after sunset, going to bed before 10 p.m. These are a few things that have some very big implications for somebody's health status.
Yeah, I really like all of that. Obviously, if you've been listening to my podcast, there's this sort of open question about earthing and is it productive still in all parts of the or all parts of North America. Some horrible decisions were made by whoever designed the electric grid in North America, and we allow return current to be passed through the earth. In fact, a study indicates that 70% of return current doesn't go back to the point of distribution or the point of generation through the wires. It actually goes through the earth, which opens up the possibility of current flow through our bodies when you have more than one point of contact with the earth. So you put 2 feet on the ground, and then as you have current flowing in this direction, you're going to have a voltage potentially between those 2 points. And it's kind of like the red light panel thing. When is something productive and when is it not productive? We don't have a calculus really to indicate that. So the other thing is that we are finding frequencies in the ground that don't have anything to do with the power system. I can take an oscilloscope and I can put a couple of probes in the ground, and I can see waveforms indicative of frequencies that have nothing to do with power generation or delivery. So even if you were on 1 foot as opposed to 2 and having that connection with the earth, it's still a bit like touching an antenna that's radiating certain frequencies. All that having been said, I still put my bare feet on the ground where I live. And I'm going to continue to do so. If I lived next to a substation, an electrical substation, I wouldn't. Personally, I'm not giving anybody else advice. If I lived near a cell phone tower, no way. A server farm, no way. A Bitcoin facility, no way. A fiber optic repeater, in a community, no, I just wouldn't do it because of the strange frequencies that those things are going to produce. And I know there will be people who will say, oh, well, just it's not productive, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I just don't buy it. And the reason is because I was so critically ill with electromagnetic poisoning, and I serve people who are terribly sensitive, as I once was. And they all tell me that they benefited from this direct contact with the earth. So I just wanted to clarify while we're talking about that. So, and you've mentioned various times and getting various exposures and then eliminating exposures. Being in front of a computer is just not a really great thing. We have these kind of get by things that we can do, like these are blue blocking glasses, and I do wear them, and I find that I can notice a difference in my health. I hate spending time on a computer. I think if health and life is your outstretched arms under the sun with your feet on the ground, every moment for me spent in front of a screen is the opposite of that.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's for everybody to decide how much time they want to spend doing that. But anyway, those are just a couple of the comments that I had. And then with regard to nighttime exposures, man, has this been an interesting?
That's a tough.
Say, go ahead.
That's the tough one that a lot of people kind of have a harder time grasping.
Yeah. So when I first went to this, and I took these, and I put them on in the evening, I fell asleep. So it goes back to what we were talking about before, which is this cortisol production and melatonin production. And where you've got one going, you shouldn't really have the other going. And this blue light stimulation could be still triggering the cortisol production, which may be inhibiting the melatonin production. So It is powerful. If you haven't experimented with this, I would just encourage people to do it. What my wife and I do is we have what's called a party light bulb. If you use that word when you're looking up incandescent light bulbs, it's a 25-watt red light bulb. And we put it low, not overhead, but low. And then when it gets dark, we turn off all the other light sources and we put those on. And you know what? It isn't perfect, but it is a lot better than having blue light coming out of LEDs or fluorescence or whatever. So yeah, that's been really powerful for me. I also get involved in designing homes for people who are looking for the absolute minimum synthetic EMF exposure possible. And my next home that I design, I want to put in, like you see in the old theaters, you know, the little lights that they have that are about waist level or lower, so you can see your way through the theater if you have to get up in the middle of the show. And I want to put little red incandescent bulbs in those and sort of have a daylight and then a nighttime lighting. So your thoughts on that, and then I want to talk a little bit before we close about the class that you're going to be offering soon.
Well, that's where it gets fun when it comes to customizing homes and implementing circadian friendly lighting systems and making sure you're protected from the non-native EMF. I think that's an area that I'm going to explore deeper as I go as I work with this work over the next few years. But I am a firm believer that it is pretty simple, actually, if you study the big levers here with after sunset exposure. Making it as dark as possible is key, as you mentioned. Any of the circadian friendly lighting systems that have, or even bulbs that have no flicker, low non-native EMF readings, those are very important. There are quite a few companies out there that offer that. But I think at the end of the day, it's making sure that the environment is as dark as possible, that you have the blue light blockers on to control for any external lighting source that you can't manipulate or change. And then making sure that you're just creating a relaxing environment. That's the most important thing in my mind. And we can also, I mean, you can go levels deeper into this. Like there's a lot of debate about you have some melatonin suppression from like circadian friendly red lighting, and then you have artificial blue light, which absolutely decimates it. That I feel like is just, we're diving into the weeds a little bit too much. As long as we can maintain the majority of our melatonin that we're producing after sunset, which comes from the pineal gland, and it needs darkness to stimulate that process, then I think we should be totally fine. And that would then support our sleep, which also has so much regenerative potential.
So there, one last question, and then I want to start talking about your class. But you mentioned melatonin production and the pineal gland. So the pineal gland does produce melatonin, but there's also intracellular production of melatonin. Is that moderated by light exposure as well? Do you know?
Yeah, so this is the fascinating thing about melatonin. It's that it's actually a light and dark hormone. So it's not, a lot of people say that it's a hormone of darkness, but that's only focused on the pineal gland form of melatonin, which is the circulatory form. When we study the intracellular or subcellular form that's produced by the mitochondria, we find that near-infrared light from the sun stimulates that form of melatonin. And what's interesting through the work of Scott Zimmerman and his colleague, I forgot his colleague's name, maybe Reiter, they found that 95% of the melatonin produced in your body systemically comes from the subcellular form during the daytime. And only 5% comes from the circulatory form. You still need both, in my opinion. You still need to be in touch with the light and dark cycle, but getting the morning sunlight exposure, being outside with skin in the game, midday sun exposure, that is going to lend itself to a massive increase in melatonin production, which is why I fundamentally believe that people respond to midday sunbathing with feeling tired. Like it's the perfect time to take a nap, because in my mind, you have this subcellular melatonin going through the roof, essentially.
Yeah, and that subcellular melatonin, I don't know whether we really know what all the purposes of that are, but it is an incredible, perhaps the most incredible antioxidant available. So my understanding is having that within the cells can really quench a lot of the problems that are caused by synthetic EMF generation.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that there's a study that shows it actually protects against UVB radiation as well to a certain degree. So it's it's almost like nature has figured this out. The sunlight hitting the skin, you have subcellular melatonin to protect the cell, but also give it all to also provide all of the benefits that it provides. And so it's a perfect system in my mind.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, let's tell me about your class that you're either thinking of or you're soon to introduce or you've just introduced it. I just heard it from a friend, but tell me about what that is.
So it's actually a course. It's called the 80/20 course, and it falls in line with the Pareto principle, something that I've used for my coaching with individual clients. 80% of the results come from 20% of the effort. So it just points to this idea that there are some very big levers that if you get in check, you have most of the benefit that this lifestyle offers. Um, while I would say that it is only that, it's only about the 80/20 principle, it goes into extensive detail about things like biophoton emissions, skin cancer, melanoma, the full spectrum from the sun and what it offers, what each individual wavelength offers. It gets into a little bit of the grounding and electromagnetism. I'm not so well versed in that arena, so I'd be very interested to get your perspective on what I put in there. Whole bunch of things with like the inverse square law and things of that nature. And then a little bit of water and hydration as well. I think that's an important part when it comes to the light, water, and magnetism trio. But basically, I view it as the end all be all of courses for circadian biology as of right now, because there's going to be new evidence coming out. There's going to be a lot more stuff coming within the next decades. And so I just want to make sure people have an actionable system and framework to be able to implement this work while also being given a lot of the scientific evidence and circadian evidence that we have to offer today.
Whatever comes that's new next year, and I agree with you. We'll find out new things. I feel confident saying it isn't going to be avoid the sun and avoid what fresh air exposure that we can get. So,
Yeah.
Zaid, how can people get in touch with your work?
So I'm most active on Twitter and Instagram at Zaid K Dahhaj, Zaid K Dahhaj. And then that's also the same handle for my website. You can find us at the 2 a.m. podcast. We talk about a lot of different things. We talked about raw dairy in the past, a little bit of sunlight, things of that nature. And then Substack as well, same handle, Zaid K Dahhaj. But that's mainly where you guys can find me.
All right, fantastic. Well, hey, this has been a lot of fun for me. Talking to somebody who's knowledgeable about the synthetic EMF exposure and somebody who is way deeper than I am, or probably ever will be, with regard to circadian biology. This is a very personal thing for me because my dad was a genius. He was in World War II, and when he survived some really heavy fighting there, he decided to become a physician, and he spent his whole life doing that. And he taught at a medical school, and he did research at one time, and was a department head for a very large hospital system. And so I always looked up to my dad, but I remember it was in the 70s, possibly the early 80s, but I think it was in the 70s. I walked into his study one day, and he had something in his hand, and it was a little metal thing, like it had a circle within a circle. And I said what every little kid says when he sees his dad with something he's never seen before. What's that, Dad? And he said something about circadian rhythms. And I was just a kid, I had no idea what that meant. And so I probably asked him for a peanut butter sandwich or whatever I came in the room for. And now, he's no longer with us, so I can't go back and ask him. But just to think that he, along with people like John Ott, were discovering things that we're only rediscovering now, it just kind of fuels my personal interest in this. So, Zaid, I just want to thank you for spending some time with us and encourage people to check out your work. appreciate you being here.
Thank you as well. Your work has been phenomenal for me as well. So it's reciprocated.
Oh, praise God. Thank you.